What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. We all love to start up a new Pokemon game and start to work on building a team. Or maybe that's just me. But regardless, it can sometimes be difficult to create a successful team because the regions are not cooperating and seem to severely restrict the amount of Pokemon that can be found early on. Especially in the early days where they were pretty restrictive on the number of Pokemon that you could encounter before the first gym, meaning that you were lucky if you could scrape together enough for a full 6 slots, and rarely have a full usable team by the second gym, which is about the early game cutoff. However, the Pokemon rosters are also full of other options that would be perfect for obtaining early on, but are arbitrarily banished to far later in the game when you're already likely to have found alternates that are just fine or even better than the ones that you can find later. So it would really do these Pokemon a huge favor to be found before they usually show up. Like for instance in Kanto, I would say it's most pronounced with Poliwag. You would think that this little tadpole would be one of the easiest Pokemon to capture, since back in the day Poliwhirl was basically a top 5 mascot for the series, on par with Pikachu and Clefairy, getting central focus on the cover of Time magazine. So it can be easy to forget that in the actual games, it took quite a long time to actually acquire. See, in Kanto, the only way to get a Poliwag is by fishing with a good rod, not even by surfing, which isn't so bad, except for the fact that you can't get the good rod until Fuchsia City. This means you don't even have a chance to hook one until the 5th gym. This is especially baffling because these water types can walk on solid ground. So unlike its exclusively sea-bound counterparts, you could have encountered them along any route that you choose, when other prominent mascots got seen well before the second gym. And it's not like they're worried about getting a Poliwrath too early because you would still need a Water Stone to evolve it. So I have no clue why there are so many Pokemon locked behind putting the good rod too late in the game for anyone to care, but at least Johto gave it a minuscule chance at the old rod fishing one up. But speaking of Johto, there are plenty of options for earlier captures, mostly any of the numerous Pokemon that wait until the post-game before you can see them, but I actually wanted to discuss Pokemon that were in Johto already, just not early enough. If you ask me, Snubbull would fit that bill quite nicely, since you can't even find one outside of Route 38, and even then it's a 1% chance. However, it did get quite a boost in Crystal, so for that alone I'll have to change my answer to Aipom, who has always been rare in Johto, due to it exclusively being found in Headbutt trees. This means that you can't even try for this silly monkey until after Azalea Town, and even then it's never above a 20% chance. I guess maybe the real problem is locking so many Pokemon behind obscure encounter methods that are put off for far too long, but for Aipom, especially in Johto before it could evolve, you really need to be able to find the long-tail Pokemon early enough so that it can be used before being outclassed by other stronger Pokemon. I get that monkeys do actually live in trees, but that only works if we know there are any monkeys to be found there at all. So please let us know that Aipom is there by encountering it in a standard form somewhere. But next in Hoenn, there are plenty of possibilities, like say Barboach, that has a similar issue to Poliwag only being fished up by the belated good rod, or others like Electrike, Baltoy, Spoink, Cacnea, Chimecho, or even Feebas could all use a little more time. But I think the real standout here is Spheal, because Spheal, despite being adorable and the start of a solid all-around Pokemon line, the poor thing is only found all the way in Shoal Cave, like 30 minutes before the end of the game. This has the byproduct of making you encounter the Jolly Seal basically at the point of evolution, and in Oros you're actually twice as likely to just find a Celio instead. If they wanted to just have the last two, I wouldn't even complain about them being so late in the game, but the small base stage really makes it stick out as needing to be found earlier. I'm not even saying on Route 1 or anything, because that is still a bit of a high evolution level, but I would believe finding one in Meteor Falls or something a little earlier than after the 7th badge. If this is just because it's part Ice type and they have a clear bias against putting Ice early, then they could just make sure that it doesn't learn any good Ice attacks until a bit later. Spheal deserves better in its Hoenn region, and it could handily help you if only they would let you have it. Now, Sinnoh is a bit odd because they do have a decent spread, but still have lesser Pokemon being found far too late, like say Chatot, who initially was only right outside Sunyshore, despite being a random one-off bird. So you're not all that likely to pick one up right at the end of your journey. But what I would really say is Burmy needed to be found much earlier than it is. Notoriously, the bagworm Pokemon is solely found in the honey trees of Sinnoh, which makes it so difficult to actually acquire, necessitating you to wait at least 6 hours to maybe get a Burmy, but probably not. If you could find a Burmy in Eterna Forest instead of last gen's regional bug, that would make it a lot more prominent as the branching insect in Sinnoh. And then maybe you could even find Burmy in other places to properly show off its environmental forms. Basically, nothing about these Pokemon were handled well, and frankly, I don't even like any of them. But that doesn't change the fact that Burmy is in dire need of standard encounters, instead of once again being shackled to a mechanic that's just a bit too complex for its own good. And not to be outdone, Unova also had a bug problem, or lack thereof, since you couldn't find either regional bug until after the second gym. The line I often hear is that the starting routes are intentionally bland so as not to disrupt the type matchups of the Striaton gym versus your starter. But that doesn't explain why you can't pick one of them up until after you've beaten Lenora. Sewaddle and Venipede should be right there amongst the others of Roggenrola, Blitzel, or even Drillbur, but no, you'll have to wait to get a bug after those much cooler Pokemon. And even though bugs are famously weak, both Livani and Scolipede are quite capable team members, both having their own strengths, being far from the helpless stereotype. You could also argue that maybe Dwebble should show up a little bit earlier, but some people are legitimately convinced that Unova doesn't have any regional bug because these Pokemon are so sporadic, not even being in the early sections of Black and White 2, even though they wouldn't have given you any particular advantage there anyway. The point is, these poor guys can never seem to catch a break. Kalos is pretty easy, honestly, since Dedenne is just randomly thrown out into the deep end, when pretty much any other Pika clone is gonna be relatively soon, compared to when this little smallest one can be found all the way on Route 11. And even then, it's only a 5% chance anyway. And plus, you can find an Emolga on the previous route in Kalos. And beyond that, the only other spot in the region to find Dedenne is the Friend Safari, so that hardly counts. I don't get why they would want to hide the new fairy-type variation of this trope, since that was the shiny new toy for Gen 6, but it's almost like they were ashamed to show that it was in the game, because there is no shortage of areas that Dedenne could have fit before Reflection Cave. Or hey, there's Dendemil Town, which basically shares the same name, so maybe it could have been some sort of mascot or something, just throw it a bone. Now, for Alola, I would love for the version-exclusive Ice regional forms to have been found an island or two earlier, but I guess I can understand why they didn't do that. Same with Marini, I get why this one's a little bit rare. However, when the same thing happens with Bounsweet, it makes me scratch my head. The Bounsweet line is the main 3-stage grass family for this island chain, yet you can't even find one until the Lush Jungle Trial with Mallow, which is the 4th one. So going through the entirety of Melee Island, and pretty much all of Akala, means that your team has been well established for at least an hour or two, and leaves the bouncy fruit too late to even approach being tempting to pick up. Also, it's just not in the Ultra games at all. You have to breed a Steenie just to get one to fill out the dex. So if those are your Alola games, then you can't even try a Bounsweet. And the weirdest part of its exclusion from the early routes is the similar evolution pattern to the starters. So it would not be out of place to show up beside a Pikipek or a Rockruff, back when it would still be relevant for the team makeup. The Galar region is a bit different because not only do we have the wild area that houses many Pokemon, but also access to the Isle of Armor. But that's fine because Silicobra isn't really in them. I mean, technically you can find Silicobra in a max raid battle before the first gym, but are you really supposed to wait for a Pokemon to show up that you don't even know exists yet? You could be there for hours mostly covering Pokemon you already know. The Isle of Armor is a bit more reliable, but for some reason the Sandy Snake is still only accessible when there's a sandstorm already happening in the overworld. Even in Pot Bottom Desert, so good luck finding one before Route 6, while that is a fitting environment that puts Silicobra after the 3rd gym, an extended trip through the wild area, and Hammerlock for the first time. So I think we might have finally discovered what it is that makes this Pokemon look constantly sad. And Hisui is a bit different, all things considered, but I gotta say, I really wanted Hisui and Voltorb to be a lot earlier than the 4th map, but being trapped at the top of Mount Coronet, when I wanted to put one on my team immediately, it felt like an eternity before I could pick up the Grass-type Pokeball. But enough on that one, the next main point is Paldea, and I'm gonna have to say, Wattrel. You may disagree, because you can technically find one down behind Nemona's house if you double back, but most players are not likely to do that. And really, that's the problem for any method of trying to find a Wattrel. You have to go so far out of your way to track one down. This should not be the case when other regional birds are handed to you, whether you want them or not, here in Paldea, and it's not like the water connection is a limiting factor, because we're still near the ocean and even pass over multiple water sources to get to the first town. So why could we not have this storm petrel fly by in an obvious manner, like the other early staples of Route 1, instead of having to scour the ends of the earth just to find one? It can't be because the flying type was too overpowered against the first two gyms, because they hand out other ones like candy. So if Tandemaus isn't the answer, because they should really also be found a lot easier too, then having a decent shot at a Kilowattrel from the very start, like any other game in existence, would make Paldea much more enjoyable than having to wait for an hour or two. So, those are some of the Pokemon that I think would benefit everyone as early route encounters. But if I may take just a moment to plug a second channel that I intend to post on much more, that allows me to discuss anything else besides Pokemon, subscribing over there would help to get it monetized. And also, I do feel weird asking people for money, but I have been encouraged to make a Patreon, so if you feel so inclined, it'll never be more than just a couple of bucks a month for a contribution if you want to help make videos on this channel. But with that said, those are the Pokemon that I would recommend to be early route captures, helping to flesh out the regions and have the Pokemon be better appreciated in their time. So do you think Magnemite should have been an early Pokemon to get that Steel type in there before the power plant? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.